A few minutes later, he felt himself advancing into deepening water. Then stopping for an instant, he put on the golden ring as instructed by the witch and continued to walk forward. Soon he felt the water rise from his ankles to his waist, and from his waist to his throat. One step more, and the water closed over his head. Once under the waves, the sailor hesitated, uncertain as to which way to turn. Little by little, however, his eyes grew accustomed to the touch of the water, and he saw, lying on the bottom a few feet ahead of him, a small ball glowing with a pale light. Stooping to touch this strange object, the sailor discovered it to be a small sea plant which had anchored itself to a stone. He soon discovered that this light was but one of thousands. Together they formed a long straight line across the level floor of the sea, and the sailor assumed these lights to be signs of the road of the sea world. The sailor advanced along them slowly until he reached the gate of the city under the sea. The sailor walked through the gate and found himself on the main street of the city. Along the broad avenue grew giant sea plants with brown leaves set out in rows like trees upon the land, and through the foliage, which moved heavily in the currents, little fish darted like little birds do through the branches of trees. Many people were walking along the avenue, all dressed the same, wearing tight-fitting clothes made of shining fish scales. The sailor looked into their faces and saw that a broad golden ring encircled the pupils of their eyes. Then suddenly 2 men of the sea with swords of red stone moved through the water, seizing the sailor, and hurried him before the king. On a coral throne in a great hall roofed with a high circular dome sat the king. "Welcome," said the king, staring with his golden eyes at both the sailor and the enchanted ring on his finger. "You have come at a fortunate time. This very evening we celebrate the wedding of the second eldest daughter with the mortal who wears the second enchanted ring. Stand here upon the steps of the throne, for they are coming at once. Let the trumpet sound." At this command, 2 youths of the sea lifted huge conch shells to their mouths and sounded them. Great doors to the hall instantly opened wide, and in walked the Sea King's second daughter, hand in hand with a young man in whom the sailor recognized as his second oldest brother. Presently, the conch shells sounded again. "The prince and the princess," cried a voice, and the king leaned over from his throne and whispered in the sailor's ear, "This is my eldest daughter and her husband. They were married just a year ago. The prince is also from the world above and wears the first of the enchanted rings." In entered the eldest princess of the sea, walking by the side of her husband, and in the husband the young sailor beheld his eldest brother. The young sailor stretched out his arms to his brothers. Neither of them remembered him, for while faint and hungry, they had forgotten the warning of the witch and had eaten the food of the underworld. The memory of the world above, the lost emerald, and their father's plight faded away. The conchs sounded a third time. "Now come to the wedding banquet," cried the king. "You shall sit beside my youngest daughter." At that, the sailor lad was hurried into the banquet hall and seated at the royal table beside the king's youngest daughter, and she was the most beautiful of all the three. Noticing that the youngest son was not eating the food, she said to him, "Why do you refuse to eat the delicious food of the wedding banquet?" "Princess," replied the sailor, "I have come to the underwaters to seek the emerald of the sea, for if I return to my own country without it, my father's life will be forfeited. Would you have me forget?" "But you will never find the emerald of the sea," cried the princess. "Never find the emerald of the sea? What do you mean?" said the sailor anxiously. "The emerald of the sea has disappeared," continued the little princess, fixing the sailor with her golden eyes. "Years ago it was stolen from my father's treasury by a wicked prince of the underwaters. My father pursued him and overthrew him, but in the struggle the emerald drifted to the shores of the land of the dawn. There it remained till the prince of the unknown isles purchased it and took it away in his black ship. This ship, overcome by a storm, sank, but where it lies we know not. Whoever finds it shall be master of the land under the sea, for the emerald is master of us all. My father will not lift a finger to help you find it. If he knows that you are in search of it, he will force you to eat the food of the underwaters. Say nothing, therefore, of your quest." At these words, the brave sailor's heart sank very low. Mindful of the witch's warning, he made sure not to eat a morsel of the food, yet he knew that hunger would soon bring weakness. Either he must find the emerald at once, or he must abandon all hope of finding it. In the meantime, far away upon the land, the poor merchant whom the king had now cast in prison watched the days pass one by one until the last year had now come to its end. Every morning he would ask for tidings of his sailor son, but there were no good tidings to tell. And now back to the underwaters. The eldest sister said, "We must rid ourselves at once of this newcomer. Do you not see that he is the younger brother of our husbands? I saw him stretch out his arms to them as they passed. If we are not careful, he may lead them away from us. Let us tell our servants to lie in wait for him and deliver us from such a danger." Later that evening, just as the poor sailor was standing by one of the great doors, a dozen rogues in the service of the eldest sister fell upon him, bound him with cords, and dragged him through the water to the royal stables. Now the people of the underwaters, having no horses, had tamed great dolphins to carry them about. 100 of these dolphins were ranged along the side of the stables, and on the fiercest and angriest of them all, the princess's servants tied the sailor. The great fish pulled, rolled, and thrashed his tail, but to no avail, for the poor sailor lad was fastened tightly to his back with a rope of seaweed. Then the creature was released and scurried into the wilds of the underwaters. For half an hour, the fish, frightened at his burden, fled at lightning speed. Then, ceasing his mad flight, he tried again to shake himself free of the sailor. He turned, he leaped, he dived, but all in vain, for the sailor was securely fastened to his back. All that long night he fled. Toward the morning of the next day, however, the sailor managed to work one arm free and draw the cutlass from his waist. With this, he released himself from his bonds and rolled off the fish's back. The great animal, delivered of the weight, shot madly toward the surface, but the sailor tumbled through the waters to the bottom. Weak and hungry, the poor young lad gazed about in the half-gloom and found himself on the lower slopes of a sunken mountain rising from the ocean floor. In no direction could he find a sign of the city under the sea. Hoping, however, to see better from the mountain's top, he decided to climb it. Strange plants and shells lay in the crevices of the weedy rocks. Schools of bright fish fled past him like living arrows, and huge crabs scuttled away as he appeared. Suddenly, lying on her side in a little ravine of the mountain, he saw a ship, the black ship of the Emerald of the Sea. Though very weary and weak, it took the sailor but a moment to clamber aboard and hurry past the broken masts into the captain's cabin. A steady green radiance shone in one corner of the weedy room, and hastening toward it, the sailor found, at last, the Emerald of the Sea. The box which had enclosed it had rotted away and fallen apart. "Victory!" cried the sailor. "The emerald is mine at last, and I shall save my father." He took the great jewel from the broken box and rested it in the cup of his two hands. How it glowed on his pale flesh! Then, thrusting it into a pocket, he hurried out again to the mountainside. In the world above, it was high noon, and the level rays of the sun beat deep into the green waters. So bright had the slope become that the sailor lad felt sure that he could not be far from the surface of the waves. Moreover, if the mountain top rose above the waters, it would form an island in the upper world. And so, indeed, it was. Climbing on toward the top of the mountain, the sailor first scaled a steep cliff, and at the top of this he found a gentle slope of sand. The sun rays now illumined the water so brightly that the air seemed only a little distance away. The water grew very much warmer. The shore was finally at hand. A few steps more, and the youngest son emerged on the beach of a beautiful isle. Half blinded by the sun, he walked toward the dry land. There he found some delicious fruits growing and a rippling brook of crystal water. He ate and drank, and his strength returned. Himself again, the sailor took the Emerald of the Sea in his hands and cried, "By the power of the Emerald of the Sea, I summon here the 2 elder princesses of the underwaters, and my 2 brothers, their husbands. There was a sound of far thunder under the clear blue sky, and a moment later 4 heads rose out of the waters, and shaking the salt spray from their eyes, the princesses and the brothers walked through the shallow water to where the sailor was standing. The princesses were very much frightened when they beheld the sailor holding the all-powerful emerald, and falling to their knees, begged him to forgive their misdeeds and to not take away their loved ones. "Be merciful and forgive," said the younger of the sisters. "After all, had we not caused you to be spirited away, you never would have found the emerald." "That is true," said the sailor. "My brothers shall decide for themselves. Break then the spell which binds them to the underwaters. Restore to them their memory of the past, and if then they choose to remain, I shall not try to lead them away. Reverse the spell." "That is easily done," said the elder sister. "Let them but touch the food or drink of the upper world, and their memory will return." In less time than it takes to tell it, the sisters offered the enchanted brothers water from the rivulet. When they took a sip of it, both the brothers became pale as death. Their eyes opened wide, and they stared as strangely as men do when waked from sleep suddenly. Then, seeing their younger brother, they ran to him and threw their arms about him and asked 1,000 questions about their father and the quest of the emerald. The golden-eyed brides watched them with sad faces and finally broke into quiet tears. Imagine their joy when their husbands reassuringly turned to them, telling them to cheer up. Then the sailor and his brothers took counsel as to how the Emerald of the Sea might be brought to the king in time to save their father's life. You can imagine the sailor's horror when he discovered that because of a bad error in the calendars, the life of his father had in fact been forfeited to the king 3 days before. All the 3rd year, the poor man had lain in a small cell in the royal dungeons, waiting anxiously, oh so anxiously, to hear the quick step of the sailor's son on the winding stairs just outside the prison door. But the year came to an end, as you know, without his return. For the 3rd and last time, the castle guards led the poor man before the king. The king had never forgiven the merchant for the loss of the jewel. His anger had only increased with the years, and he was very glad that he could finally take his revenge. "Have you found the Emerald of the Sea?" asked the king harshly. He stood erect on the steps of his judgment seat, arms folded, eyes fixed in a fierce black frown. "No," said the merchant quietly. "Take him away," cried the king. And the merchant was tied hand and foot and then tossed into a little boat without food or drink and sent adrift to die helplessly in the lonely seas. Bound hand and foot, the merchant lay motionless in his little craft and stared up at the blue sky. After some time, a merciful sleep overcame him, and as he slept, the wind arose and swept the little boat along with it. Meanwhile, On the beautiful island, the sailor and his companions, stunned at their discovery, began preparations to return to the underwaters. Just as the twilight fell, the sailor, whose eyes were the keenest, saw a little boat rapidly drifting ashore. The sailor hurried toward it and seized it, and looking in, he uttered a ringing cry. The old merchant lay on the floor of the boat. He still lived, for they could see him gently breathing. Lifting him up tenderly, the three sons carried him to the shore, loosened his bonds, and brought him back to life. Now when the merchant was himself again, the sailor, through the power of the emerald, caused the waves to carry a great ship to the island, and on this ship the three sons, the two princesses, and the old merchant returned to their country. They landed secretly, however, for they knew that the angry king would seize them if he knew of their return. One night, shortly after their return, word was brought to the sailor that the king had heard of the merchant's escape and was sending guards to arrest the merchant and his companions. It was almost midnight when the sailor lad received the warning. Taking the emerald with him, he advanced to a window by the ocean and cried out over the moonlit waters, "Waters of the sea, rise and overwhelm the palace of the king." Now the king's palace stood apart by itself on a tongue of land running far out into the tide, and soon the rising waters were flowing over the marble floors and pouring in through the windows. One by one, the lights in the 1,000 rooms, touched by the waves, hissed, sputtered, and expired. The servants of the palace, one and all, ran away and left the dark castle to its fate. Little by little, the advancing water crept from the walls to the balconies, from the balconies to the towers, and from the foot of the towers to their very tops. Finally, all the moon could see as it shone upon the flood was the flag of the highest turret of all, and finally that too disappeared under the waves. Locked in his secret treasure room, opening the jewel coffers one after the other, the king remained quite ignorant of the disaster. For some time, no sound reached him in his hidden retreat because the door of the treasure room was very thick and strong. Suddenly, he heard behind him the sound of falling water, and turning toward the door, beheld streams of water gushing through the passages between the door and its frame. Horror-struck, he watched the door burst from its locks and hinges, and a roaring cascade of cold seawater came pouring in the room, and a moment later the whole castle crumbled and fell to pieces. Now, when the king had met his fate, the people of the country, who greatly respected the merchant, offered him the crown, but he refused it and instead gave it to his 2 elder sons. Thus it came to pass that the country had 2 kings. Each brother in turn reigned for 6 months of the year and spent the other 6 in the city under the sea. As for the sailor lad, he sailed the sea for many years and finally married a beautiful young woman who he happened to meet on one of his travels. Then, like all sailors, he and his bride went to live in the countryside. His house was built of gray stone with vines of ivy and a beautiful apple orchard beneath its windows, and they all lived happily ever after.